here we are back. This is Dr. J. Smith, and as you can see, I've got someone new over here. This is Thomas Alexander from Germany. Thomas, this is the first time we've ever had you on PfanderFilms, is it not?
Yeah, hi Jay, thanks, I'm glad to be here.
Well, listen, Thomas, what I want you to do, this is a new thing we've been doing. For those of you who've been following through PfanderFilms, we've been bringing all kinds of different men from different countries. Mel, you all know Mel from Ireland. He is the first that I brought on board. Robert Spencer I brought on board over a year ago from America. I've also had Murad. Murad has been around for a number of years now from the Middle East. And then more recently, I've been bringing people like Joe from Red Judaism and also Paul from London. And then most recently, you've all been enjoying Odon Lafontaine from France. And we've heard the French school, we've heard the Irish school, we've heard the English school, and we've also heard the Middle Eastern one, but we've not heard the German school. And it's the German school that I've been waiting to talk to and find out about. But the problem with the German school is I don't speak German. And I assume that most of you who are listening don't speak German as well. But Thomas is German. On top of that, he speaks fluent English. And what has been interesting about Thomas, he is one of those that I came to know because of the comments. The comments. I mean, we've always been saying, write comments. Reflect on what we're saying. Get back to us. Confront us. Agree with us, dispute with us, whatever way you do that. We read the comments. I do want to hear the comments because that's how we get peer reviewed. And Thomas has been doing that under a different name, but Thomas not really confronted. He was supporting some of the things I said. And the more I got to read his material, I said, hold on, man, this guy really knows an awful lot and seems to be coming from a rich background. So I put out a feeler to him and I said, listen, whoever you are, I'd love to get to know you. I know that that's not your real name. People very rarely use their real name on the internet. But I said, here's my email, come and contact me. And so he did. And here he is. Thomas from Germany has now contacted me. And what is fascinating about Thomas is that he knows the Inarah school. And I'm going to ask Thomas to go and introduce himself, but also explain who the Inarah school is and what is it about the German school that is different than, say, the French or the British or the American or the Middle Eastern school concerning the historical critique, because this is all to do with the historical critique. We're critiquing both Muhammad, we're critiquing the Quran, we're critiquing the origins of Islam in the 7th and 8th up until the 9th century. And he is going to bring you an entirely new way of looking at things. I've gone already through some of these videos with Thomas, so I know where he's going to go with it. And I'm excited because he's going to introduce some new ideas that none of you, or maybe I should say that the majority of you have never heard before. Certainly not on this channel. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Thomas. Hello, Thomas. Give us something about yourself. Give us a little bit of your background. And then can you unpack the Inarah school and can you start introducing us to some of the main players in Germany, some of whose names we may know, but what they did and what they their work and what they have found, we don't know. Over to you. God bless you. Thanks for coming on board.
Yeah, thanks. Glad to be here. My name is Thomas, and my background is actually not in history or religion, but in computer science. But I've always been a history nerd. And roughly 20 years ago, I really started getting into history of religion in general. And at first, I wasn't particularly interested in Islam, but then, let's say roughly 15 years ago, I stumbled upon a radio program which had Karl-Heinz Ohlig as a guest. He's one of the main figures of this Inarah school you talked about. And he introduced me to some completely new ideas that I hadn't heard before. And that was sort of the trigger that led me down into this rabbit hole. So I read up a lot on this topic. I really got involved and I guess part of my personality and also my training is understanding and recognizing patterns, like in all kinds of data. And that's sort of what I did.
This is the man you're talking about, right?
Exactly. So he published this book.
Oleg, who wrote this book, he was an editor for this book.
He was editor of this book, and this is a book published by this Inarah group. And they've published, I think, 7 or 8 books by now, all like this one, but only the first one, the one you're holding right now here, is translated into English. All the others are only in German.
This is it. This is all we know about that whole school that's going on there in Germany. So thank you for actually, you're going to unpack some of what's in here, but you're also going to be showing us new stuff that is not in there that we need to hear about, because there in Germany, you have a whole different branch of instruction. So could you just explain what Inarah is?
It's an Arab word that basically means enlightenment. And that's what the group has called itself. They are located in Saarbrücken in Germany, or at least that's the core of them are located there. It's sort of a loose group that they are all over the place, but the core of the group is in Saarbrücken in Germany. And they are basically building upon a long tradition in Germany of historical criticism. And I'm here today to introduce you to some of the main players, as you said, and then later on we'll see where that leads us and what they found out.
Well, listen, so the Inarah school, enlightenment is what it means. It's the Arabic word, but you're saying that they are in Western Germany. Saarbrücken is a city. So this school, these are what we would term the German revisionist school. Am I correct on that?
Well, we could call them that, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, yeah.
Well, listen, they go way far back. They're not rather recent. They're not as more recent as those who are Carl Zeiss, Oleg, and others. You're going to go and unpack a little bit about the German school.
Exactly. And I'm not just looking at German scholars, but I'm looking basically at the history that this Inarah group is building upon, which is mainly located in Germany, but also includes others. And I think with that we could go right into my presentation.
Okay.
So we're going to look into the origins of Islam, and first we're going to look at the Quran, and particularly the critical Quran studies and the history thereof. But first of all, why even do this? Like, why even engage in historical critical studies? So let's first start with some facts about the Quran. So what we do know is that the early manuscripts of the Quran were written in what's called defective script, or in Latin it's scriptio defectiva. And what it means is that there are no vowel markings or diacritics. So that means of the 28 consonants in the Arab alphabet, only 7 are unique. The remaining signs can refer to from 2 up to 5 different consonants. So it means that we can't really distinguish between letters like F and Q, J and K, S and D, S and Sh, R and Z, D and Da, T and Z, and so on and so forth. We also have vastly differing styles within the Quran. And we have also 3 different words for God in the Quran, like Allah, Rab, and Rahman, which indicates 3 schools of scribes. In many cases, a large number of short verses in the Quran are followed by one massive verse. So that's a good sign for an interpolation. Because if you think about it, at a point in time where the number of the verses was already established, if you want to add something, what you had to do was to blow up a single verse, basically, to not change the order of anything. So that's why we find those occasionally. So for example, Surah 74:31 is one such case where we have lots of small verses and then all of a sudden a really long one. So all of these are just like some surface level observations, but they already show us that there's definitely reason to look deeper into this, that there must be more than one author, for example. And so that's what people did. Yeah?
This sounds similar to the biblical studies, the Hebrew biblical studies, and the documentary hypothesis that we've had from the 1800s coming out of Germany as well. So the similar problem exists with the Quran, you're saying.
Exactly, and that's also where the people came originally from, who started this whole endeavor of analyzing the Quran. So they the first ones basically came from this biblical historical study, and then they figured, well, let's have a look at the Quran. Like, nobody's done that before. Let's see what we find. Yeah.
Just for those who are new to what you're saying, let me just unpack a little bit of what you're saying so we don't go too fast on this. If you have a script that is defective, it's not that doesn't mean necessarily it's defective. It just it is not readable, is what he's saying.
That's a technical term. Yeah. So what it means is basically so the Arab language basically, or in the Arab written language, you need to have those diacritical marks and the vowel signs to properly make sense of a word. If you don't have it, there could be countless of words written or hidden in there. So that's what's called a razm in Arabic. So that's a couple of letters without those diacritical marks, and there can be many different words in there depending on how you put those signs. And the early Quran manuscripts, they don't have those signs.
Yeah, and of course the diacritical marks we're talking about are the dots above or below the line. There are 5 dots that have been added since the 7th century and the 8th century. We don't even know exactly when they were canonized and became formalized. Some people say 8th, some say 9th, others even I've heard say 10. But 3 dots above. 1 dot would be the na, or the N letter. 2 dots would be the T letter. 3 dots would be the TH letter. Th, as we know it. 1 dot below would be the B letter, and then 2 dots would be the ya. So na, ta, ta, but ya. So those 5 dots, and also the vowels. There were no vowels at the very beginning either. No dama kasra fata. If you look at this, you're showing a picture of the Birmingham folio there. That's the 2 folios there. You can see there are no dots there, and there are no vowelizations that you're showing on that. So there's an example of the scriptio defecta, as you call it.
Exactly. So that's a technical term. It doesn't mean, as you said, it doesn't mean that the language is defective or anything. It's just this particular way of writing is called scriptio defectiva because you can't really interpret it without the dots.
Dots were needed so they knew what they were reading. And of course, once if you have just 3 letters, 3 bowl-shaped letters, which and you put dots above it, you can get 19 different words. Some, Al-Fadi, my colleague, says you can get as many as 33 different words just by putting the dots in different places. And that's his native tongue. Okay, the other thing you're talking about is that since there are different names, just say for God, Allah, Rabb, or Rahman, it could be completely different writers, is what you're assuming and what you're inferring. Am I correct? So there could be different writers, suggesting, therefore, that it was not from heaven or sent down to a man named Muhammad, that these are different. These are really different authors. So you're implying that there's different authorship.
Exactly. So in different places in the Quran, different words for God are used. So that really implies that the writers, or whoever wrote it, used that word. So it must have been different writers.
So already you're implying that this is not eternal, that this does not come from Muhammad, or that this is not coming from Uthman. You're saying that these are written at a later date by different authors. This is going to confront the standard Islamic narrative enormously right there. So you're right out. We're just getting started with you, Thomas, and you're already shutting down any notion that this book could have come from or is eternal. That's in chapter 85, verse 22 of the Quran. Or that it cannot be changed. That's in chapter 10, verse 15, and chapter 18, verse 27, or that it's protected by Allah himself, and that's in chapter 15, verse 9. So you're really confronting what almost 99% of all Muslims believe right there in just your first 5 minutes.
I guess so, yeah. I mean, I'm at this point, I'm not drawing any conclusions yet, but I mean, the facts speak for themselves.
Okay. You're not coming to a conclusion, you're just putting it out there. That's fine.
Exactly.
Okay.
So we will get to conclusions.
You have come to a conclusion right there at the very bottom. Clearly, more than one author. So
yeah, true.
That's a conclusion.
Yeah, that is one.
And author,
and there will be more.
It's not from God.
Yeah.
Ooh, those are big ones. Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure that everybody's following what you're saying, because there's an awful lot you have said in just your first 5 minutes that Muslims will take umbrage with. But that's why we're here. We're here to actually ask these kind of questions, and they may be damaging, but they need to be asked. Here he is, Thomas, from Germany. What is fascinating about Thomas is that he knows the Inarah school. And I'm going to ask Thomas to go and explain who the Inarah school is and what is it about the German school that is different than, say, the French or the British or the American or the Middle Eastern school concerning the historical critique, because this is all to do with the historical critique. We're critiquing both Muhammad, we're critiquing the Quran, we're critiquing the origins of Islam in the 7th and 8th up until the 9th century. Can you unpack the Inarah school and can you start introducing us to some of the main players in Germany, some of whose names we may know, but what they did and what they their work and what they have found, we don't know. Over to you.
Next up, I'm going to introduce you to some of the main figures of the critical Quran studies. And the three people you see on the screen right now, those are generally regarded to be the three founders of modern Islamic studies. So those were the first. We have on top, you see Ignaz Goldziher. He was a Jewish Hungarian Orientalist and scholar of Islam. He was educated at the universities of Budapest, Berlin, Leipzig, and Leiden. He went then on a journey through Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, attended lectures of Muslim sheikhs in the Mosque of Al-Azhar in Cairo. And he lived disguised as a Muslim for the duration of his travel. So he really got involved to see the inside of Islam, but he remained a devout Jew throughout his life. And he is like one of the best resources still to this day. He has written some fantastic stuff, most of it in German though. There are also some French texts from him and some Hungarian ones, but most of his work is written in German. And it's definitely worth checking him out. So next on this list, we have Theodor Nödeke. So he was a German Orientalist, Semitist, and linguist, and he's one of the people who really came from the biblical studies first. So he started out with researching the Old Testament, Semitic languages, Arabic, Persian, and the Syriac literature. He translated several important works of Oriental literature and wrote numerous studies, including on the Quran. And then lastly on this list of the three founders, we have Christian Snoek-Ogrogne, who is was a Dutch Orientalist, Arabist, and Semitist. He actually studied under Nödeke and became a teacher of Islamic law for Dutch officials before they embarked to their colonies in Indonesia. And similar to Ignaz Goldziher, he also traveled to the Middle East. He actually traveled to Mecca, where he disguised himself as a teacher of Islamic jurisprudence in order to study the pilgrims. And then they started it off, and then pretty quickly this field was blossoming in Germany. So there were countless of names. So I've prepared another slide here. I've only put 3 names on this one. I could have put 30 names on here because it was really towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, this field was exploding. There was a lot of interest, a lot of people flocked to this field. But I've picked 3 who will be relevant to what we will discuss later on. So first, I've put here Adolf von Harnack. He was a Baltic German Lutheran theologian and prominent church historian. And he assumed a Jewish Christian origin of the Quran. So it's also sometimes known as Messianic Jews. So basically, he assumed that it was Jews who wrote the Quran originally, Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah. Then we have David Heinrich Müller. He was a Jewish Austrian Orientalist, Semitist, linguist, and literary theorist. And he conjectured that in the Quran there was a hidden verse structure. Basically, that there were rhymes in there hidden at some deeper layer. And then lastly on this list, this is now the first one who wasn't part of this German school, if you will. His name is Alphonse Mingana. He was an Assyrian theologian, so he came from what's now modern-day Iraq. Back then it would have been the Ottoman Empire. He was a historian, Syriacist, Orientalist, and a former priest. He's best known actually for collecting the Mingana collection of ancient Middle Eastern manuscripts at Birmingham and The Birmingham manuscript that we've just mentioned is part of his collection. So he brought it to England. And what's more important or more interesting for us later on is that he already speculated that the Quran contained Aramaic words and phrases. So that will be important, as we will see. Okay, now moving forward in time. Now we're going to the 1970s. And now this is obviously a big jump. So we started at the end of the 19th century, then beginning of the 20th, and now in the 1970s. Like, why this big jump? Well, the thing is, even though it was a really popular field at the beginning of the 20th century, it died pretty quickly. Now, one reason was, of course, the world wars in between. So they really shut everything down. But another one was also that the scholars sort of hit a wall. So what they were used to when they studied the Bible was to having a etymological dictionary. So like a dictionary which contained like all the origins of every word. And that doesn't exist for the Quran, and it still doesn't exist today. So that makes work on the Quran a lot harder than work on the Bible. But by the 1970s, people picked up again. But this time I couldn't show you 30 names. I could maybe show you a few more than those 3, but not a lot. Okay, now first on my list here we have Günter Lühling. You may be familiar with this name. Actually may be familiar with all 3 of them here. But Günter Lühling, he was a German theologian, philologist, Arabist, and scholar of Islam. Exactly. Jay's showing you the book right now.
This is his book. Terrible title. Don't read the title. Read this part. Let me just read what it says, because this describes what the book's really about, the undertext. And it's called The Rediscovery and Reliable Reconstruction of a Comprehensive Pre-Islamic Christian Hymnal hidden in the Quran under earliest Islamic reinterpretations. He was able to go back and find strophe for strophe for strophe, Christian hymn after Christian hymn that had been taken from the Syriac and interposed into the Quran. Hugely important. And of course, we now have this in English.
He changed the diacritical marks. So he still assumed that this was an Arab text, but was able to find a lot of hidden verses in there. That is a hidden verse structure there.
So correct me if I'm wrong. One thing that Lühling did, he didn't use. So you're saying he didn't use the Syriac? He actually just changed the diacritics, took the dots and put it in different places, so they get different word formations. And by doing that, he was able to find strophe for strophe the hymns that were Christian, that had been lifted from the Christian hymns that were from the 5th and 6th century.
Exactly. So that's what he did. So basically, because the original manuscripts don't have diacritical marks, he thought, well, maybe those were put in incorrectly, and he played around with them and found Christian hymns in there. And actually, in 1970, he wrote his PhD thesis on this topic, and he got the grade Opus Eximium, which is Latin and basically translates to outstanding work, which was the highest grade you could get back then. And it typically meant that after your PhD, you would simultaneously be accepted, or this work would simultaneously be accepted as an habilitation. So what he did was he basically restructured his PhD thesis into the book that you just saw and handed it in as his habilitation. But instead of being accepted, he was kicked out in 1972, and his work completely ignored for decades.
Okay, that's hugely important what you just said there. I hope people are listening to what Thomas is saying. This is his doctoral thesis. Now, this is the English translation that we got translated in just the last, in the last 20 to 25 years.
The PhD thesis was handed in 1970. So 1970, maybe 1 year or 2 years before he started. I don't know exactly when he started, but yeah. So in 1970, he handed in his PhD thesis and got the highest grade possible.
Which should have been an automatic invitation to be a professor.
Exactly. So it basically was a road to a tenure professorship.
A tenured professor. For those who don't know what that means you cannot be fired. You're there for life. Yeah. But he never received it. And then he got kicked out of the university in 1972 Because of what he found here, or what was the reason?
Yeah, so the establishment didn't like what he said. So they never engaged him. They never said, oh, you're wrong. They made him look like a crank and kicked him out and just ignored his book, basically.
Well, there's the censorship that we're seeing, that we've talked about many times. People who are confronting the standard Islamic narrative today. But this is in Germany. This is in Europe that he gets kicked out in you would assume the one place that you should be allowed to ask these kind of questions and come up with this kind of research. The fact that it was recognized so highly as the highest degree you can get in Germany, proving that those who read it actually gave him credit for it, yet those in authority did not want him to receive that professorship, and he got kicked out of the university in 1972. Tragic when you stop to think of the implications.
So really, he could have had like a very productive career, and instead he lived his life in poverty, basically, was dependent on welfare, never got a foot back on the ground, and was completely shunned. And actually this English translation of his book was very important, because once this came out, his work was suddenly available to a wider audience. So it couldn't be ignored anymore. And it immediately received international recognition. And quickly afterwards, he was basically completely rehabilitated. Because everybody who had ignored him before, they couldn't keep it up anymore. So they had to engage his arguments, and they had to accept that, yeah, well, he has a point, and he's most likely correct. And
Isn't that interesting?
That's thanks to the English translation of his book.
Well, we had something to do with that, and we went to meet him in 1999 in his home with his wife. I've got pictures of us there with his knickerbockers on. He was wearing his knickerbocker. A very engaging and very, in some ways, eccentric individual. But I had no idea just the importance of what he had done in the 1970s, why that was not recognized, and why it is now being recognized on its credit. But his academic acumen that he was able to put to the text itself, the Quranic text. Well, thank you. This is new. See, this is the kind of thing, these are the kind of historical background and stories that we need to hear, because it is these men whose shoulders we now stand on because of what they did before, and before they have gone through. We can then take their material and take their findings, their research, and then run from there. So I'm encouraging everybody, the challenge to Islam for Reformation, get it, buy it. You can still get it on Amazon. It won't be there very much longer because it's going to be sold out. Get a copy. It is quite large, and start reading it, and then start applying what he's saying there to what we're now finding about the Quran. Thank you so much about Gunther Ludding. He was a friend before. He's no longer living. He's now passed away, but in 2014. But he was a friend when I got to know him in 1999.
And next on this list are two names that, again, you may be familiar with. We have John Wensbrough. He's an American historian and Orientalist who taught at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. And he then obviously came from a slightly different background. He was not part of this German background, but they all moved in a similar direction. And he's the founder of the so-called revisionist school of Islamic studies, and most famous for rejecting the historical credibility of the classical Islamic narratives. Then last one on this list is Patricia Krone. She was a Danish historian, Orientalist, linguist, and scholar of Islam. She studied under John Wensbrough and was a member of the Revisionist School of Islamic Studies. She taught in Oxford, Cambridge, and Princeton. And like von Harnack, she conjectured that Islam has its roots in Judaism. She also rejected the idea of Mecca as the cradle of Islam, which we will also get to. Mm-hmm. And with that, now we're going to jump to today. And
go back just 1 minute quickly to Patricia Krone. For those who don't know, Patricia Krone came under an awful lot of censorship and an awful lot of harassment by other scholars because of her book Hagerism. What's interesting, she rejected the theme of Hagerism, but not the material, not the research that she did for Hagerism. If you get a chance to get a hold of the book, take a look, and when you open it up, you will notice that the footnotes in almost every page dominate the pages. And it's those footnotes that are absolutely gold mines, because she could read and write 15 languages, and being able to read and write that many languages as a linguist, she was able to go back to many of the original text and just brought them into English so that we could read them. And that's one of the things that she has not been recognized for. So here were two people, were Lulling and Krohn, who were both ostracized. Krohn didn't get the ostracism that Lulling got, nothing of that nature, but very much a harassment against her conclusion in Hagerism, rather than people looking and seeing the research she had done. We're doing that now for her in some ways. And this is one reason why it's so good that we have YouTube and we have people like you to come and resurrect these people and get them out to a much more popular stage and a much larger audience. So in some ways, we are the ones, the next generation that's going to come behind all of these great thinkers and make sure that their material gets popularized.
Exactly. And with that, let's jump to today. And now here I've presented some of the names that are in some way, shape, or form associated with this Inarah group that we talked about before. So not all of them are located in Saarbrücken, but they've all published for Inarah, and they're all connected, basically. And I'll just go through them real quick. I could have put a lot more names on here. I've picked the ones that, again, that will be relevant for my later presentation. So first on the list is Karl-Heinz Ohlig. Again, he's the one who basically brought me into this subject matter. He studied philosophy, Catholic theology, and history, has a PhD in Catholic theology, and he's what I call the great synthesizer. Right? So he's really good at taking two steps back, looking at what all the other people find out, and then putting it together to form like one coherent picture. Next on this list, we have Volker Popp.
Just to let those people and see that I've underlined almost every other sentence that he wrote there. There was so many gems that he had just in his introduction. And then the next one you're going to show, Volker Popp, he's also in this book. So those of you who want to get this book, I would highly recommend it. The Hidden Origins of Islam. It's on Amazon.com.
Definitely this book is a gold mine. There's a lot of good stuff in there. A lot of which will influence, a lot of my presentation is based on that book as well. So next up, Volker Popp. He studied ethnology, African studies, Islamic studies, Turkology, and Iranian studies. He was a consultant and teacher in Turkey, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. He was a curator for the creation of museum collections in Kuwait, Qatar, and Riyadh. And he's the expert on coins in this group. So if there's anything to know about coins from this period, he knows it. He's seen all the coins, we went through all the catalogs, and coin expert. Mm-hmm. Next one, Ibn Barak, again, probably known to a lot of people. He studied Arabic and Persian in Edinburgh and London, and he taught at the University of Toulouse in France. And he's sort of the communicator of the group. Like, he's really good at making what this group finds accessible.
I've got 3 books right here. I've got many more. I'm just going to show you quickly. I mean, there are so many books that he is credited for. And as you said, he is the one that takes everybody else's material that are no longer being published and then republishes them so that we have access to them so that we can read them. They're not necessarily, they're not his research. He's doing, in some ways, what he did is what we're doing. And that is to take what others have said and then bring it down so that the whole populace can read it, so they don't become obscure, because it's so important that we do acknowledge those who have gone ahead. And Ibn Barak has been the best in doing that.
Next one is Markus Groß. He's a linguist. He studied phonetics, phonology, Romance studies, Indo-European studies, Oriental studies, and applied linguistics. And then, as you can see by this list, he's the one to go to if you want to dissect a text and analyze it in detail. Then we have Robert Kerr. He's a former professor of the Ancient and Near East at the Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, where he was responsible for studies in languages, literatures, history, and archaeology of the ancient Near Middle East. So doing a lot of stuff there. He studied Assyriology, Egyptology, Semitic studies, archaeology, classical philology, Hebrew studies, comparative religious studies. As you can see, like he is basically a jack of all trades. Very knowledgeable guy. Then we have Johannes Thomas, professor for Romans.
Just before you go, isn't he also head of Inarah?
I think he's now, I think it used to be Karl-Heinz Ohlig, but now he's taken a step back, and now Robert Kerr is basically the head of Inarah.
And he's originally from Canada. I mean, he's Canadian.
Actually, I think he's German. Pretty sure.
He's German. Okay, I thought since he was at Waterloo.
Well, I haven't looked him up, but I've seen him talk, and he talks pretty German. and he speaks, I think actually I saw him speak English when it was with a German accent, so I'm pretty sure he's German.
Okay.
Yeah. Then we have Johannes Thomas, professor for Romance literature and Roman studies, and he's the expert on Muslim Spain. If Gerd Puyn, again, another big name here. His background is, again, Islamic studies. He wrote his PhD on early Islamic governance. He spent a year at the University of Riyadh in Saudi Arabia and teaches Oriental studies at the University of Saarbrücken. And he's basically most famous for his being responsible for the restoration and the cataloging of the Sana'a manuscripts.
Yeah.
So he spent 4 years in Yemen from 1981 to 1985. He was the first scholar to look at those manuscripts, which are some of the oldest manuscripts of the Quran that we know of, and also the only ones that are not of the Uthmanic text type.
Right. Okay. Now, just to be clear, both he and his wife, who has a doctorate as well, Elizabeth Quinn, they have been working on the Sana'a manuscript and have come up with quite a few very controversial conclusions that many Muslims do not care for. But you have to give him credit. He's been working on this. Well, so you're talking about for 40 years now, going on to 40 years.
Yeah. So that was definitely some very important work. Because I don't think anybody since has looked at those manuscripts again, at least not from a scholarly perspective.
Well, we do, excuse me, real quickly, we do have Asma Hilali, this book here, the Sana'a process. I don't know if people would call this a scholarly look, and I think you're correct, Thomas. This is rather a populist look at the Sana'a, and she has been criticized by a lot of scholars because she didn't really do what Gerd Puyn has done or his wife has done. And you could see this is more of an apologetic, a very apologetic reference book on the Sana'a manuscript. But this is the first one that's in print in English. You have Gerd Puyn in Germany. I wish we could have him in English so that we can get his book. He's been working much more on it.
Maybe to clarify what I meant is nobody has physically looked at those documents and examined them, right? So, I mean, of course, there are always people who basically take Gerd Puyn's work and build upon it. But as far as I know, not all of the manuscripts that they found in Sana'a have been catalogued and analyzed, and nobody has done that since Gerd Puyn was down there.
No. And you have also Sedege and Gudarzi. I think that's the way you pronounce it. They have also looked at the Sana'a. But no, I don't think, as you're right, nobody has the stature of Puyn when it comes to that.
Okay. And then next on this list, we have Geneviève Bobillot. Now, she is French, as the name implies, and she's professor for Arabic and Islamic studies in Lyon in France. Her main fields of study are Islamic mysticism and its connection to Neoplatonism, as well as some spiritual currents among the Shia, comparing Islamic spirituality with that of other religions, and theories on the question of the sacred. And then one of the younger people on his list is Marcin Grodzki. He's an Arabist and Islamic professor of Islamic studies at the University of Warsaw in Poland. And then last on this list, with a big question mark, is Christoph Luxemburg. And actually, he is the one I want to focus a bit more on. Exactly, Jay already holding up his book.
This is the book that's done so much damage, and this is why I'm so glad you've come to help us out, because we need someone like you, Thomas, who has read it, understands it, can unpack it for us, and we're going to do a whole video just on his findings. But I'm so glad you brought it. And the reason you have a question mark is we don't have any picture of him.
Exactly. So he's publishing under a pseudonym. Actually, I've got a whole slide reserved for him because he's going to be important in the next video we're doing. So Christoph Luxemburg publishes under a pseudonym, doesn't want to be recognized. He's a specialist on Semitic philology. He taught classical Arab and several Arab dialects, as well as Syriac at German universities. And he's an expert on translations. And with his book, which you've just seen, he broke new ground because he showed that the Quran contains Aramaic words and phrases. So this is also what already Alphonse Mignana hypothesized, and he also had some good evidence for it, but he didn't have like a proper, let's say, methodology to accessing it. And Christoph Luxemburg developed that.
Am I correct in believing that he has been on as well?
Of course. So, as with everybody who brings something new to the table, the first reaction is always skepticism and rejection. With him, basically, you can see that there are criticisms coming from two sides. On the one side are Muslim scholars. What they typically do is they sort of either they completely misrepresent him, like they just sort of build up a straw man and then try to destroy that one, or they try to nitpick. So I mean, as with everybody, sometimes it's not clear that whether he's in one specific place right or wrong. Maybe he made a mistake. That sort of thing happens. And what Muslims try to do is like they try to nitpick, to find like one instance where you could argue, well, maybe it's not correct, and then ignore everything else, basically. But on the other side, we also have criticism from the, let's say, established mainstream university area. But what they're doing is similar to what they did with Lühling. They don't engage him on his core arguments. They're saying things like, what you're doing is not helpful, we're going to invite Muslims to have a dialogue, and with your book, you're making that impossible, that sort of thing, which I guess is fair enough, but that's not what scholarship should be like, right? This is no longer looking for the truth. This is now looking for something else, like for friendship between the faiths or whatever you want to call it, but not looking for the truth anymore.
Isn't that interesting?
There's nobody who's really engaging him on his arguments.
Isn't that interesting that, Thomas, that we are here is two examples that you've given me, actually three, Lühling, Patricia Corona, and now here with Christoph Luxemburg. In all three cases, they came up with original work, which in the university system should be the place that original work is discussed. Can you imagine that if this would have happened in biblical studies? It is because of the German school that we have historical criticism applied on the Bible in the 1800s, Wellhausen and the whole Tübingen school and the documentary hypothesis and all these different didactic source criticism, textual criticism of the Bible has been vibrant there in Germany. Why are the same criticisms not applied to the Quran? Or let me just put it this way, when they are applied to the Quran, what suddenly is this shutdown or censorship of the very people who are applying what was earlier applied to the Bible now cannot be applied to the Quran? Why do you think there is this double standard, or at least what I consider double standard?
Yeah, I guess there are probably two sides to this. One, most likely fear, I guess. I mean, we've seen what happened with the cartoonists in Denmark. I mean, obviously, that's also the reason why Christoph Luxemburg isn't publishing under his real name. So I guess that's probably one reason. Another one I could see is sort of like almost this racist notion of the noble savage, right? So they see Islam sort of in this idealized romantic light, which I think is blatantly racist, but they think is like the right thing to do, obviously. But But I think those two maybe come together. So they want to see Islam in a good light, but at the same time they're afraid of Islam, sort of, and so they better not. They don't want to engage any of the material that could be controversial.
So, because of the fear of Muslims, of what might happen if their name gets attached to their research, they ennoble the Arab text, and they don't.
I'm not sure if that's because they're afraid. I'm just feeling those are two currents that are going on. Whether they are related or not, I can't say. But I think both is going on at the same time. Yeah.
Can I suggest the third option?
Yeah.
And this is something that was brought home to me by Patricia Corona herself. And that is almost every one of these departments. I'm sure it's the case in Germany. It's certainly the case in Britain. Any of these Near Eastern departments are dependent on finances coming in from Saudi Arabia or from Qatar or from Bahrain, these countries. And in order for them, in the case of SOAS, even from the Sultan of Brunei, who built a $10 million building there on the campus for the school. But with all those dollars coming in from these institutions, there is also the understanding that those institutions must not be critical, certainly at a base level. And that's why, while I was there at SOAS, Dr. Gerald Hotting was the last teacher to teach John Wandsworth's material and the revisionist whole theory. And I don't know of anybody that's taken up from there. And I would suggest that maybe an awful lot of these scholars know where the money comes from. And they're fearful that if they do come out with this and go public with it, all their funding will be cut off. Not just their funding, but also the institution. Patricia Corona said this to my face when I asked her to do the debate for me. I said, you know it so much better. Why aren't you doing it? She says, because I have a chair to protect and I have an institution that I represent, and I dare not confront both the institution or the chair. And I said, well, that is tragic. So if that is the case, then I would suggest this is a real problem, because we have allowed in our Western universities to the Muslims to now fund them and fund these departments.
That definitely makes sense. Although I feel like, at least in Germany, the mainstream is now slowly picking up on what Christoph Luxemburg has said. They still publicly, they don't want to have anything to do with it. They're sort of, if they're not outright denouncing him, they're ignoring him. But when you look at what they're doing, while they're sort of denouncing Luxemburg, they're doing very similar things now. So I feel like his methodology is slowly taking hold, and I hope that more will come of it. Yeah. Okay, and so this was the last slide for today. But before we end this, I would like to give you a little story about Christoph Luxemburg, particularly about his PhD thesis, which was on a 9th century Syriac manuscript that refers to earlier Greek texts from the 5th and 6th centuries. So in his work, he discussed homilies, among them the homily of Jacob of Saruk, and according to Ibn Barak, he was able to give a fuller description than hitherto. But his main task was to identify the Syriac texts in the 9th century manuscripts with the help of the original Greek manuscripts. And that turned out to be a really difficult task, because back then, translations were extremely literal, to the point where they were almost unreadable. So you can imagine, kind of like if you go to a foreign language website and you let it run through Google Translate, you oftentimes get elements of this page which are very literal and don't make much sense in English.
Yeah.
So that's sort of what he had to deal with, but not with any modern language, but with Syriac and ancient Greek. So he thereby acquired important insights that led him to develop a method that he was then later able to apply to the understanding of the Quran. So in this Syriac manuscript, he tried to identify the fragments and the authors, which were both previously unknown, by comparing the Aramaic manuscript with the original unedited Greek texts. And he got copies of Greek manuscripts from all over Europe, from libraries and universities. In painstaking work, found all the sources except for one. In this one instance, the original Greek had been lost, or the Greek manuscript had been lost, which happens, obviously. So then, based on the writing style of the Syriac translation, the abridged Syriac translation, as well as the subject matter, Luxemburg was able to identify Severus of Antioch as the author. And indeed, years later, a Jesuit scholar from Rome discovered a manuscript in Damascus which confirmed Luxemburg's conjecture. So that's the kind of genius we're dealing here with. So he's looking at a Syriac translation, a abridged Syriac translation of an old ancient Greek text, and he was able to identify the author. When I read this, I thought, wow, this is mind-blowing stuff. And next time we'll see what happens when this mind goes to work on the Quran.
Terrific stuff. Hey, listen, so this has been good as an introduction. This is an introduction to our good friend Thomas Alexander, who has agreed to come on board. He has been introduced to me on the internet to begin with, on YouTube, as one of the commenters, like many of you are commenters, and has had this unique ability to not only understand the Inarah school, the German school, but to communicate it in brilliant English. You've got your